Today, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you Dr. Katharina Krause. Dr. Krause is a research associate and postdoc at the International Center for Ethics in the Sciences and Humanities at the University of Tübingen in Germany. Her doctoral research, which she's turning into a book, explores the connection between images, health, and security in infectious disease. And some of her dissertation work focused on Ebola, but it's broader than that. Today, she's going to be talking about this book project, and her talk is entitled Follow the Image, Seeing the Entanglement of Health and Security. Please help me welcome Dr. Katharina Krause.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here. For me, it's really a great opportunity to talk about my ongoing book project. Like Joe said, I'm right in the process of turning the PhD thesis into a book. I'm currently revising the manuscript, and I hope to resubmit in spring, early summer. So this is a great time for me to get some feedback, and I'm really looking forward to all your questions and comments after my talk. So the tentative book title is also the title of my talk today. It reads, Follow the Image, Seeing the Entanglement of Health and Security. And as you can already see in the title, I'm interested in the intersection of images, health, and security. And throughout the book, I want to unfold the argument that images not only visually represent health crises in a sort of passive manner, but that they actively participate in how we make sense of health and health security specifically. So together, or specifically, I want to argue that images make visible different layers of health security that then together define infectious disease as a threat to the body, through the body, and within the body. And my book then seeks to sort of explore how these different layers then unfold within the image, but also between, in front and behind the camera, between the depicted persons and the onlooker, and ultimately also between global north and global south. And in the following 40 minutes or so, I want to walk you through this argument. And then, like I said, I'm really eager to hear what you think. And these are the 4 points I want to make. First, I want to talk about why this topic, why am I writing this book? Then briefly about how I think we can make sense of the image in the case of health, but maybe also beyond. So these are the sort of theoretical ideas that inform the book. I think here I should add that I'm a political scientist by training. I have a master's degree in peace and conflict studies and international relations. So this might be different from what all of you are doing, but I still hope that there's some merit in all of this. And then the main part of the talk is about what I call the 3 visual nodal points. So this is the empirical material that I'm considering. The first nodal point starts at the very micro level. I'm here looking at images of virus particles. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that one specifically. The second node then looks at the suffering body. Here I'm interested in visualizations of the direct or indirect consequences of infections. I'm sure you all remember images from intensive care units during COVID, from treatment centers during the Ebola epidemic, and so on. I want to state right up front that I've decided not to include these type of images into the presentation for today. Some of them are very graphic, and even though they are publicly available, I thought I didn't feel comfortable with just throwing them out there. I will leave it up to you if you want to look them up or not. And the third nodal point then finally looks at protective clothing. Here I'm interested in how the measures taken to prevent the very severe symptoms discussed in the second nodal point, how they are visualized through the full body protection suit during Ebola, for instance, or through the face mask during COVID. Then I have a short conclusion, and then there's hopefully plenty of time for discussion. And throughout these 4 points, I will try to do a bit of a mix. I will, of course, talk about the content of the book, but on a different level, I'm also trying to speak about the writing process itself, how I hope the different chapters are speaking to one another, about the challenges, struggles, but also the joys attached to this writing journey. So this is the plan. And to get started, the first question is, okay, why this topic? Why am I writing this book? And and I think this is important to mention to provide you with an idea of where I'm coming from and what my sort of curiosity behind this book project is. So in many ways, my book journey and also the PhD before that starts with the protection suit. In 2014, as part of my master's degree, I spent a semester abroad in Washington, D.C. And before I left for the US, I had just learned about different theoretical takes on security. Securitization theory was one of them. And with all these concepts and debates in mind, I then heard and watched the news about the Ebola epidemic unfold whilst being based in the US. And in the late summer, my host university then sent out an email informing all of its students what to do in case of an outbreak on campus. And this was the first time that I thought, health and security, this might be interesting to further explore. And then I started to read the literature out there on health security, which now informs large parts of the theoretical work done in my book. Then with October came Halloween, and several of my friends and colleagues dressed up in protective clothing, referencing the Ebola epidemic, or as Ebola zombies even. And this was when I first thought, okay, images, health and security, this might be an interesting topic. And then I started to read about visual IR, visual international relations, and so on. Then I went back home, and in 2015, another interesting thing happened. 3 of the most prestigious international photography awards were given to image series on the Ebola epidemic. So a Pulitzer Prize, a World Press Photo Award, and a Sony World Picture Award all went to image series depicting the Ebola epidemic. And at that point, I then felt more and more convinced that the visuality of health crises is worth of an in-depth analysis, and here I am 10 years later trying to finish the book. And I think what was really sorry, here you can see an image of the protection suit as an Ebola costume. This is where it all began in many ways. And what is really interesting if you engage with the literatures on visual international relations and health security is that these are both very vibrant fields, right? So in health security, we find the argument that there's a growing connection of health and security, that critical engagement is needed with this so-called health security nexus. The overall argument here is that health security is socially constructed and that we should be sensitive to this sort of construction. Then, on the other hand, we have this literature on visual international relations and specifically about visual security studies, and all these debates there make the point that images are highly political, that events are not really separable from their visual representation, that images shape how we imagine certain events. And we can clearly see that in the last 10, 15 years, both academic debates sort of made the move from being very nerdy niche topics more into mainstream international relations. But, and this is, I think, important, they do so rather separately. There's not so much conversation taking place. And my book now very much rests on the claim that this is really a missed opportunity, because if the so-called health security nexus is socially constructed and gets stronger with every health crisis, and if images play a key role in the social construction of security, then bringing images, health, and security together seems highly relevant for me. And this sort of relevancy is very nicely summarized in this quote from a CNN news episode in the 90s on an A streptococcus outbreak. And I think it resonates with the measles outbreak we talked about a few minutes ago. The quote reads, "The doctors say, don't worry, but the pictures say, oh yeah, you should." And I'm still really happy that I came across this quote because it nicely points at the core of my book, which is precisely this sort of intersection of images, health, and security. So this is sort of the background, the motivation of this book. And before I will show you some of the actual images that I discussed there, I briefly want to talk about my theoretical perspective that also builds a key part of the book. With the book, I'm trying to make both a theoretical and an empirical contribution to the existing literatures out there. So also for the theoretical work, the quote at the beginning is interesting, because if you look at it again, I think it's noteworthy that the image here has some sort of agency or performative power, if you will. So it's not a photographer who uses the image to make a point, but in this quote, the image itself acts and makes claims about how worrying the health crisis actually is. And I think we probably all know statements like, "An image says more than 1,000 words," or "Fix or it didn't happen." And I think all these sayings made me then wonder what exactly is the power of the image, and how can I make sense of this in a theoretical, conceptual manner? And in this sense, I think the quote also highlights a key theoretical challenge, which is, how can we deal with the relations images build with other entities, like, for instance, the doctor in this quote who is contradicted? And then reading the literature out there, I had the impression that the existing works focus on the very semiotic and discursive power of the image, which always remains very close to the visual content alone, did not really fit with sort of the complexity of today's visual age, if you want to call it that way, and also was somehow at odds with my own research interests. So while I, of course, build on these debates and while they are highly important for me, I decided to put my theoretical starting point more in the health security literature, and specifically concerning the notion of health security that is proposed in this quote by Bengtson et al., where they say, okay, health security can be thought of as a web of human and non-human relations, producing priorities about threats and how they are handled. And this definition is very much located in literatures on STS, non-human agency, material semiotics, assemblage thinking, new materialism, and so on. And these approaches, and I think this is interesting and also relevant for my book, they get more and more attention in health security studies on the one hand. And curiously enough, also we can see similar trends emerging in visual IR, where recent works on, for instance, drones, scanners, cameras, and so on, ascribe agencies to these technical devices, asking, okay, what are they doing? And departing from these debates, then in the book, I want to ask, okay, what if the image itself is not only the sort of passive outcome of these devices, but can be, what do we see if we consider the image as a sort of non-human actor and thus as an active part of this network? And in the book, I want to argue that especially a sort of material semiotic perspective that puts emphasis on the relationalities and the entanglement of different human and non-human entities allows me to trace the connection between human and non-human actors, and helps me to understand the image in its interplay with, for instance, other images, texts, but also photographers, patients, medical devices, and viewers, of course. So put differently, I think a material semiotic perspective helps me to sort of be sensitive to how images emerge out of relations, circulate through these relations, are interpreted and have effects through relations. So this means in the end that I consider the content of the different visual material that I'm discussing in the book, but also ask where, how, and in relation to what and to whom they appear and disappear. So this is in a very broad nutshell, the theoretical move I'm trying to make in the book. I try to introduce images as sort of non-human entities and part of networks. And thus as highly important and entangled in this overall making of health security. And I'm doing this by using actor network theory, specifically the works of Bruno Latour, John Law, Annemarie Mohl, and others as my sort of theoretical toolbox. And you can also see this in the title of the book, where I use Latour's famous call to follow the actors and translate it into follow the image. And I think this is a promising way to sort of further our conceptual appreciation and sensitivity towards the visual interconnectedness of health and security. And of course, this then also reflects in the methodology. I think it's very important to be sensitive to questions of who is seeing images and from what position, where, so to speak, does the viewer enter the network. And in the book, it's important to me to be very clear that I am writing from my own position as a white European person. And what I'm presenting in the book is one reading of the images. And I'm very much aware that this is not the only one. Okay, so having then sorted out this sort of theoretical toolbox, the next question then for me was, okay, how can I put this into practice? And especially I took 3 decisions when I moved from thesis to book manuscript. I first decided to broaden the empirical focus of the thesis, which was very much on the Ebola epidemic exclusively. Still, and you will see this in a few minutes, Ebola still sits very much at the center, but I added images from other health crises to aim for a more complex picture, so to speak, and also to provide more context. Second, as I've already mentioned in the introduction, I decided to focus on 3 visual nodal points. 1 chapter each is dedicated to one of these nodes, and I will get to them in a minute. And finally, the third decision was that in each of the empirical chapters, I'm moving from local situations to global contexts, from situations in the image to the broader contexts. And with this, I'm trying to ask how images make the international through each and every level. Each of the empirical chapters starts with 2 images and then very in-depth discussion of their content. And then I'm sort of zooming out a bit. So it's beyond the scope of the talk to go into much detail here, but for the next 10-15 minutes or so, I want to briefly highlight some findings of the empirical chapters. And the first one is a chapter on seeing the invisible virus. So when I started writing the first draft of this chapter, the COVID-19 pandemic was in full swing. And I think you're sharing this impression. I still very much remember how the first 3D image, which we saw right at the beginning of the virus, was sort of celebrated as an act of making visible the invisible killer, of giving a face to the pandemic, and so on. In an interview, the creators of the CDC model, they stated that it was actually their job to produce an identity of the virus, which I think is really interesting. What is the identity of a virus? And I was also struck by how omnipresent this model then, or other similar visual renderings then became. For instance, in news media reporting on the pandemic, but also on shop windows during lockdown, in vaccination centers, on magazine covers. In Germany, it was even part of the contact tracing app. So my impression or my feeling then was that, like the actual virus, the different visual manifestations seem to be circulating everywhere. And I found that really interesting. And this made me wonder, okay, what are these images doing in health security terms? So this is sort of the question that shapes this chapter, and I'm trying to unfold the argument that visual manifestations of the virus matter for health security, in three ways. First, they participate in the actual making of the virus and its introduction as an actor to the health security nexus. And there it contributes to both the deepening, but also the widening of this nexus. And I will show you some examples to add substance to these abstract claims. So this is the first colorized version of the Ebola virus. Maybe you remember it it was really shared widely during the Ebola epidemic. It was taken by the scientist Frederick Murphy of the US Center for Disease Control in the 1980s. The image was major news of that time. It was part, like I said already, we saw a similar dynamic with COVID, but back then it was also a key part of the identification of the new pathogen. It was also framed as the demascation of the invisible killer. And here, I think this is also interesting from a STS perspective, from a science and technology perspective. The laboratory is sort of introduced as an important site for health security, where the virus is both identified and defeated. And the virus here is not only, and I think this is important, introduced as an evil agent, but also as a foreign entity, because, and I guess you all know this, but still identifying the virus comes with the privilege of choosing its name. And the decision was made to name it Ebola after a river in the DRC. Today, the WHO strongly advises against names referencing geographical locations. But if you think about, again, back to the COVID pandemic, about terms like the Wuhan virus, the China virus, I think we can clearly see that this dynamic is still in full swing, even though not in official terms. And attached to this sort of virus imagery, then oftentimes, and these are two examples, are ideas of what it does and attention paid either to the damage the virus causes inside the individual human body, or other images also direct our visual attention to what happens inside the virus itself. And this is part of this sort of deepening of health security that I think is interesting, because it entails a very narrow focus on microbiological processes. However, and this is, I think, where this following the image perspective becomes interesting, the image of the virus is also leaving the laboratory, so to speak. This cover image looks like a microscopic image, if you are a non-expert at least, but actually it's a stock image created by a visual designer without any background in science whatsoever. You can still buy it on iStock today. And images like this, I think, are interesting because they carry the visual aura of the laboratory, but have no scientific backup. And this is then, I think, where we can see a widening in terms of where these images are produced. And then another interesting aspect of this widening also takes place if we move to the sort of multi-sensory engagement some visualizations of viruses offer. This is again an example from the COVID pandemic. It's a scientifically correct version of a coloring version of SARS-CoV-2 as a mandala. And it was quite popular during the pandemic to enable non-experts and specifically children to sort of engage with the virus and to come to terms with its existence. And I think there's an interesting element of taming the virus by also taking part in the creation of its visuality. And we can see a similar dynamic in the plush toys. This is an example from Ebola, but we have similar plush toys for COVID and many other cases. And I think they are interesting because they offer some sort of haptical engagement. You can get to know the virus as a cute and cuddly plush toy, but it's more than this element of cuteness. If you look closely at the leaflet, you will discover again the micrograph produced by Frederick Murphy, by the CDC. The leaflet comes also with some scientific information and historical facts about the virus. So in a very broad nutshell, this is the first empirical chapter of the book. Originally, this was planned to be the last chapter. So in the thesis, this is my last chapter. But for the book, I moved it at the very beginning because I felt that starting at the microscopic level somehow really makes sense to begin this process of following. And I think it nicely, and I hope the examples I showed you gave you an idea of that. I think it nicely highlights the many different visual manifestations of viruses. And this is I felt that this would be a good start to illustrate the visual complexity of health security. So this was the first chapter. Then there's the second empirical chapter on bodily suffering and how we see suffering with the chapter. This means that with the chapter, I then move from the sort of invisible entity causing infections to the very visible consequences. And I opened the chapter with a quote, and I will give you just a minute or a few seconds to read through it. And so this quote is part of the cover letter the New York Times wrote to nominate their photographer Daniel Berehulak for a Pulitzer Prize in 2015 for his work on Ebola, specifically for the image series he took during the epidemic in Liberia. The nomination was successful, and his images became known to an almost global audience. I'm sure many of you remember his work. And according to the cover letter, and this is why I've picked this quote, the answer to what it is that images of bodily suffering are doing is pretty simple, right? So here, images of suffering and pain, they are powerful because they force the audience to care, and a key emotional response to seeing this sort of suffering then is held to be compassion. And with this, my chapter, I want to put a big question mark behind this sort of almost causal assumption. So in the chapter, I ask, okay, but what happens if the bodies we are supposed to feel compassion for are potentially contagious? And this is sort of the main question that motivates the second empirical chapter. And I propose the argument that this sort of interplay of images, bodily suffering, and emotions is of high importance for how we make sense of health security. And I think there's a sort of interesting tension between the threatened and the simultaneously threatening bodies. But the body visually matters, I argue, both as a victim and as a vector. And this, then again, I think is not only a question about visibility and invisibility, but also about different notions of distance and proximity, both within and beyond the image. And essentially, this chapter, I guess, is very much about proximity and distance and the emotions attached to that. Like I said, I have not brought images from the Pulitzer Prize series on Ebola for this presentation. You can easily find them online. If you search for Ebola and Pulitzer Prize, would be the first finding. So if you want, look them up during the talk. If you don't feel like that, then of course, please don't. Especially in this chapter, I work with a close comparison between two Pulitzer Prize series. The first one from Daniel Berehulak that I've already mentioned, and the second one from Emilio Morenati, taken during COVID-19, during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic in Spain. And I think here, especially in this chapter, a close comparison between Ebola and COVID is interesting. And I, again, briefly want to show you why I think this is the case. Especially because I think we see many differences between the image series. So especially in the case of the image series on Ebola, we see lots of sick and dead bodies. These images are very graphic, so they are not subtle at all. We see lots of suffering and desperation. And we find many images that resemble, for instance, stereotypical famine photography. One could say that here again, Africa as an entire continent is visualized as a place of misery, of sickness. And we know from existing research that rather than compassion, these type of images evokes a form of pity, which is characterized by a sort of hierarchy and distance between the possibly healthy viewer in, for instance, like in my case, the West, and the sick depicted person. So there's this strong, very colonial gaze on the ill-equipped and passive suffering in the local situation. And in addition, we also, in the image series and then beyond that, also find images of protests and resistance, for instance, images of persons escaping treatment centers. And I think in this light, this sort of distance implied in feeling pity is really significant for health security as well, because here the suffering body is not only suffering, but also highly contagious. So there's this sort of double status that is interesting, I think. And this becomes clear, for instance, in the sharp visual contrast between patients and health workers in full protective clothing, and also in images where relatives are unable to touch and comfort their sick loved ones. So while images in the case of Ebola, of the Ebola series, clearly have, one could say, a securitizing power by showing the sort of devastation an infection is causing, they at the same time also desecuritize, one could say, because they fixate the body, the suffering body, in a specific context, and thus assuring the safety of the distant viewer. And this is already summarized in this quote by Pleiker and Kai on visualizations of HIV/AIDS. Here they state that gazing at the suffering of others in far-off places may also become no more than a way of affirming the safety of the here and now, thus undermining the very humanist aspirations for social change. And I think we can see this dynamic in many of the images produced during Ebola. However, I think it's interesting, and I'm trying to work with this in the chapter, is that this sort of distance between the depicted and the viewing body can be overcome, as you can see in this cover image, for instance. And here I think it's important to know that it's not the security of the person in West Africa, but in this case of the body in the US. This fear of infection at home builds on the very well-rehearsed colonial gaze on the other, not only as passive, but also as dangerous and contagious, and also traveling. And the emotion evoked here then, of course, is neither compassion nor pity, but actual fear. And I think it's really important to be sensitive to the sort of change of referent object. The securitization move, if you want to use this language now, extends outside of the image, right? And it includes the viewer, in this case, in the US. So previously very distant bodies suddenly become very close. And this, again, I think, an interesting tension between proximity and distance here. So now, if we now move from Ebola to COVID, I think it's interesting that we find a different dynamic. The overall focus of the COVID image series is not so much on the sick and dying, but rather on the elderly as a particular vulnerable and susceptible group during the pandemic. And here, these persons are not so much shown in stages of infection, but as in situations of isolation. So it's not so much the contagiousness that is at play here, but it's the loneliness. This is one image that is part of the Pulitzer series. It shows a man in his apartment having dinner alone at Christmas Eve. And the image also comes with a quote, which reads, where he says, "The solitude gets to me these days. I often feel depressed. These holidays, instead of making me happy, they make me sad. I hate them." So there's no infection, no resistance whatsoever. There's just sadness in this image. And it's thus very easy to feel compassion for the depicted person. This is another example that became quite famous. I don't know if you've seen them in Europe. It was for a few weeks, it was the image of the pandemic. And here, this element of distance that I've been talking about plays out on a much, much more local individual level, right? It shows this sort of isolation of especially elderly persons, the material measures taken to prevent infection, to create some sort of distance. So in contrast to the Ebola image series, I think that the COVID image series does not really tell stories about infection or even resistance or denial, but about love and affection. And this is, I think it's really important to to be aware of this difference and also to be critical of it. And I think comparing the image series does, and this is also again coming back to the argument of the chapter, really highlights that seeing the suffering, or that the suffering body visually matters not only as threatened, but also as threatening, as a vector potentially carrying and spreading a virus, and the threat of contagion and this sort of associated danger of infection very much shapes the relationship between the bodies, not only within the image, but also between photographer and photographed, as well as between viewing and depicted body. So I think this sort of causal mechanism, as suggested by the quote at the beginning of the chapter, is here really, this really adds complexity, to say the least, to this quote or statement. And I think that's really what I'm interested in teasing out in this chapter, is this sort of tension between threatened and threatening body, between being victim and vector, between compassion and pity, and of these different perceptions of distance and proximity. And comparing the two image series, I think, really alerts us to also the colonial mechanisms at play throughout these tensions. Okay, so this, in a nutshell, was the second chapter. Now there's one empirical chapter left, which is on protective clothing. And again, I invite you to read this quote from the Pulitzer Prize nomination letter. So what the quote is doing for my chapter here is that it is one of the many examples of the sort of omnipresence of protective clothing during Ebola, but it also, I think, links very obviously to COVID. Here in this quote, the protection suit not only shaped the work of the photographer, it also features in many of his award-winning images. And the aim of this final empirical chapter then is to get to a more thorough understanding of what the protection suit does in the context of health crises. And again, I think it's here really interesting to look beyond the mere content of images and to pay attention also to the image-viewer relationship, something that I've already teased out in the previous two chapters. So in the chapter, I want to again make the claim that whilst protective clothing physically separates bodies from each other, its materialization as artifact, image, whatever, build and constitutes a network that visually and also sensually links the bodies of patients, health workers, and distant viewers in very different and also at times competing makings of health security. And again, to render this abstract argument a bit more accessible, here are some examples. The first example is an infographic, which you can still find on the MSF website. And I think in terms of health security, for me, two elements are important. First, of course, the contagiousness of the virus is very much highlighted. The suit emphasizes the extraordinary measures it takes to prevent infection. Consider, for instance, the 2 sets of gloves that appear to be necessary. 1 set is not enough. No, you need 2 sets. And the suit here is also presented as the sort of solution, as the technological fix to the overall threat of contagion. But in addition, and this is, I think, where the graphic goes beyond the traditional 2-dimensional image, this is an interactive graphic. So if you click on the different items, if you open the graphic on the website, info boxes will pop up and you can read more about the plastic apron or the rubber boots. And you can also learn about the price of these items. And eventually, of course, you can decide to make a donation to join the fight of the health worker as it is framed on the website. So hence, we could say that the viewer of the website does not have to remain passive, but has the opportunity to become more active, to contribute. So here's an interesting connection between health worker and viewer at play. The second example is the Halloween costume that I've already mentioned at the beginning. It was advertised as the most viral costume of the year in 2014. And I think, again, 2 elements are noteworthy if we want to think about health security. First, the costume puts health workers next to zombies, ghosts, witches, what have you, at Halloween. So the fear of contagion here is personified by the health worker. And I think this is, secondly, the key difference to the infographic, where the health worker is in need for protection. Here, the health worker is part of this scary outbreak scenario, namely the outbreak in the global north, if you consider the product description. So I think, in my opinion, it's striking how the health worker here is not so much a hero in the fight against the epidemic, but rather the personification of the risk of infection. And this, I think, also becomes clear in this final example of two magazine covers, both published in 2014. In the case of the Time magazine on the left side, the suit puts emphasis on the sort of heroic action of health workers. They were named the Person of the Year in 2014. The protection suit here can be considered a sort of superhero uniform as part of their identity. And this fits very much the quote at the beginning. The suit here is proving the sort of dedication and enormous risks taken. And I think in comparison, the Economist cover works very differently. Here, the atmosphere is much more gloomy. We cannot see the eyes of the health worker. Rather, what we are seeing is a faceless and nameless army, if you consider the headline. And here again, the health workers may seem like a threat themselves, which I think is an important dynamic. So the fear of the sort of invisible virus, one could say, is replaced by the fear of the very visual body of the health worker as a source of potential infection. And I think for me in this chapter, it's really interesting to sort of tease out how the threatened and simultaneously threatening body is visually discussed through protective clothing. And of course, this all gets even more complex if we then move to COVID, where this sort of wearing of face masks is no longer restricted to the group of health workers, but to the general public. So here we can then see how mask wearing, or how through mask wearing, these tensions of the threatening and threatened body become applicable to the general public. Okay, so to close this sort of tour de force through the book project, I want to come back to the quote at the beginning one last time. So what I hope the book achieves in the end is to demonstrate that images are doing so much more than saying, oh yes, you should worry. And I want to show how different layers of health security unfold within the image, in the space in front and behind the camera, between viewing and depicted person, and also ultimately between global north and global south. And I think within these layers, we can encounter many tensions to think through. Just a list, not a final list, but a list of them. I think we see tensions between visible, invisible, distance, proximity, threatened, threatening, sick, healthy, active, passive. One could also add inside, outside, helpless, helpful. The list goes on. And ultimately, we end with global north, global south. And for me, it's really interesting to show and to get a feeling of how images not only shape these tensions, but also at times provide bridges between them. And I think what the findings taken together then hopefully achieve in the end is that they indicate that images should be taken and handled with care. I think the findings of the book urge us to ask who is visible, who remains invisible, who is regarded to be safe, who is perceived as security risk, whose body is given attention, and whose body is ignored. And in this light, I think that this quote by Lederach of asking what is seen and made possible when we widen the frame to focus the lens on life and love, rather than limit the field of vision to death and suffering, is really worthwhile and important. And to close the presentation, I guess I want to emphasize that this sort of intersection of images, health, and security is a really interesting point to start asking this question.